Many people in the Western Church are taught that Jesus died to save us from God's punishment. But have you ever noticed that in Romans 5:10, the Apostle Paul says something that sounds really strange, if that's true? He says, "We are reconciled to God by Jesus' death, but we are saved by his life." If Jesus' death paid the price and finished the work, then what's the life part for? Today, we're looking at why this common view of the gospel might be missing the real story that Paul is telling. I'm Macdonald with the Anástasis Center, and this will be the first in a series of videos taking a deep dive into Romans. Why Romans? Well, Romans is one of the most expansive presentations of the gospel that we get in the Bible. If you're familiar with our organization, you probably know that we think most of the Western Church has gotten the gospel, the Bible's big picture story, wrong. So Romans is a good place to go to try to set the record straight. If you're new to us, we realize that's a big claim to make, but we're not the only ones saying that. And we're not trying to claim that we've discovered some secret idea that the church has missed for 2,000 years. In fact, we draw heavily from early church theologians like Irenaeus of Lyon and Athanasius of Alexandria, as well as modern theologians like T.F. Torrance and N.T. Wright, to offer a version of the Bible story focused on God's restorative justice, what we call healing atonement. A story where humans are infected with a sin disease, and God is working tirelessly throughout the Bible to heal and restore us to the kind of people who he made us to be. In this video, we're going to use Romans 5:10 as a case study. We'll look at how some theologians have tried to explain the saved by his life part of this verse, how the early church thought differently, and the story that we think Paul is really trying to tell in Romans. So first, what is it that we're actually critiquing? A story told in many churches in America. A story that goes like this. God created the world, and it was good. But humans have sinned against God, and we all deserve infinite punishment for our sins. Infinite because God is infinite. Fortunately, Jesus stepped in and took the punishment that we deserve, so that anyone who believes in him can be forgiven by God and escape that punishment. Sometimes this story is presented not in terms of punishment, but in terms of owing God a debt that Jesus pays, but it's the same idea. I get why people can read the Bible and think that this is what's going on. I did too at one point. There are plenty of verses in Romans and elsewhere that might lead you in that direction. We'll get to those verses in future videos, but for the first couple, I wanted to highlight some verses where, if you believe this version of the story, you might scratch your head a little when you come across them. As a side note, this version of the gospel is often called Penal Substitutionary Atonement. Penal, because it has to do with punishment. Substitutionary, because it says that Jesus was our substitute who took the punishment instead of us. And atonement, like at-one-ment, this being the way that God and humans are reconciled. From here, I'll refer to it as penal substitution, or PSA for short. To highlight the contrast with PSA, we sometimes refer to healing atonement as medical substitution, to illustrate that Jesus takes on our spiritual disease and cures it on our behalf. But more on that later. So anyway, as an example of a verse that's confusing under penal substitution, let's look at Romans 5:10, which says, "For if, while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son, much more surely, having been reconciled, will we be saved by his life." Why might this be confusing? Well, in penal substitution, isn't Jesus' death where he receives our punishment? Isn't that what saves us? It sounds like Paul is saying Jesus' death saves us, but his life saves us even more? That would be a weird thing to write, right? So this is one verse that, with PSA, we might be a little puzzled. There seems to be more to the story, or maybe another story entirely, that Paul has in mind while writing this. Proponents of PSA have tried to explain this. For example, John Calvin, in his commentary on Romans, translated and edited by John Owen, thinks that by his life refers to how Christ will be sitting at the right hand of the Father, and this will give him a particularly strong position of power to continue to intercede with the Father on our behalf. I don't really like this answer for a few reasons. One is that it seems to pit the Father and the Son against each other to some degree. Like, it's not enough that the Father punished Jesus on the cross, that every time I sin again, the Father is like, really want to punish that guy. But Jesus has to keep stepping in to say, but remember, you already punished me. And God is like, darn it, you're right. And maybe that's a bit of a caricature, but Owen links us to Calvin's commentary on Romans 8:34, which also describes Christ's intercession for humans. And in Calvin's commentary on that verse, he seems to inadvertently create a schism in the Trinity, where the Son is protecting us from the Father's character rather than being the perfect revelation of the Father's heart for us. Another interpretation of this verse comes from John Piper. He says that the cross exhausted God's wrath against believers, but since the final outpouring of his wrath on non-believers is going to happen in the future, Jesus' ongoing life helps to make sure that God definitely won't pour out his wrath on any believers on that day. You might picture it like, on Judgment Day, God sends some meteor bombardment against the earth, and Christ acts as a shield for believers. This also strikes me as implying that Jesus' primary role post-resurrection is to manage the Father's response to us, which falls into the same trap as Calvin. A huge problem with these interpretations is how they frame God's relationship with the world. When I read them, I get the impression of a God who would be okay, or even pleased, with the total destruction of the world and its inhabitants. Like there is this possible alternate history where God says, this creation is broken, let's just get rid of it and start with a clean slate, and that would have satisfied his justice just as well. Fortunately for us, God didn't go that route and decided to save some people to show off his mercy, but he's still going to get his revenge against everyone else. Maybe some of you watching are so steeped in this tradition that that idea seems normal to you, but it's actually very different from how the early church viewed things. Take Athanasius, for example. If you don't know him, he was Bishop of Alexandria, a major Egyptian city and a hub of early Christianity during the 4th century. He was a key defender against the heresy of Arianism, which taught that the Son was created by and subordinate to the Father, instead of both being equal parts of the Trinity. He was also a major player at the Council of Nicaea, which, among other things, gave us the Nicene Creed. In one of his most famous books, On the Incarnation, Athanasius paints us a very different picture of God's relationship with the world. Here, God overwhelmingly loves his creation, and while he is bothered that humans have turned away from him, it would be unthinkable for him to let creation waste away, and even more so for him to cause its destruction, in part because he created humans for a purpose, to take care of the earth with him, and if humanity was destroyed, that purpose would be left unfulfilled. But he also says that it would be unfitting of God's good character to let us all die. Take a look at this passage. As then, the creatures whom he had created were in fact perishing, what then was God being good to do? Was he to let corruption and death have their way with them? In that case, what was the use of having made them in the beginning? Such indifference to the ruin of his own work before his very eyes would argue not goodness of God, but limitation, and that far more than if he had never created humans at all. It was impossible, therefore, that God should leave humanity to be carried off by the corruption, because it would be unfitting and unworthy of himself. Already, you can probably see that Athanasius is working out of a different story, where God has a different motivation, where it's not God that causes death, but a kind of sickness or corruption that results from sin. We'll go deeper into that in the next video, but what can we say about God's relationship and responsibility to us? Athanasius argues, here and elsewhere, that if God really is good and really is loving, the proper response from him is not to abandon us, but to work toward the restoration of humanity, to bring us back into relationship with him. This gets at a fundamental difference between early church theologians like Athanasius and later theologians like Calvin. God's justice is not retributive, but restorative. Let's unpack that for a moment. At a basic level, justice is about righting a wrong, but people have different ideas about what it means to do justice. For instance, imagine that someone physically assaulted you and you ended up in the hospital. What should that person's punishment be? Retributive justice, think retribution, says that you right a wrong by punishing an offender. If you commit a crime, you put yourself into a kind of moral debt. You can only pay off that debt by a debt collector extracting suffering from you. So if someone assaulted and injured you, then they should also be injured somehow. This could be physical punishment, paying a fine, or going to jail and losing their freedom, but in any case, their moral debt is paid and justice is done. But notice that this kind of justice is mostly focused on the offender. The person who assaults you goes to jail, but you may still be stuck with the medical bills. Restorative justice, on the other hand, says that you right a wrong by undoing the harm that was done. The offender participates as part of the solution to any problem that they cause. In Exodus 21:18-19, if someone assaults and injures you, they are required to compensate you for the time that you lost due to not being able to work, and they also have to arrange for your full recovery. In essence, they have to fully make up for the harm that they caused you. So it's like you were never injured in the first place. Justice is done because the harm is undone, and the victim is restored. This makes restorative justice much more victim-centered. The offender still pays a price, but it goes toward the restoration of the victim. If this is your first time hearing about this concept, you can probably think of other verses that seem to demonstrate God's retributive justice, but they're not as much of a slam dunk as you might think. We'll have videos on that in the future, and I'll put a link in the description that points toward other resources you can explore on our website. Now, whether God's justice is more like retributive justice or more like restorative justice has major consequences for the Bible story and God's motivation. If God's justice is retributive, then penal substitution is right. God must punish us, and punish us infinitely, for everything that we do wrong. And given that everyone has gone against God's commands at some point or another, he would be perfectly within his rights to just destroy the earth and move on. But if God's justice is restorative, then it's more like Athanasius' picture, that God's desire is to save humanity from its own self-destruction, and to partner with us to restore the harms that we've done. Romans 5:10 is a glimpse into that restorative version of the story. Yes, we are in need of reconciliation with God. As the verse states, we are his enemies. But that's not because he has turned away from us and declared us his enemies. It's because we have turned away from him and declared him our enemy. And as this verse gets at, salvation is not just us coming back into relationship with God. It is us entering into Christ's new life, being restored to the joy and goodness and wholeness that God made us for. We'll go into more detail about the parts of this restorative telling of the Bible story in future videos, but here's the short-ish version. God created humans for something. Being God's image means we're meant to be God's representatives on earth, to follow in his footsteps. We were supposed to partner with God to cultivate garden life, human life, and God's life, to grow in relationship with God and one another and spread the goodness, beauty, and love that he demonstrated in the Garden of Eden throughout the rest of creation. But we have fallen short of that calling from the very start of the story. Adam and Eve turned away from God, causing a kind of sin disease in human nature. This sin disease messes with our desires. It makes it harder to choose the selfless or challenging or lasting good things over the selfish or lazy or short-lived pleasures that ultimately harm us or our communities in the long run. God saw that the sin disease was leading humanity on a path toward self-destruction, so he partnered with a group of humans to diagnose their sickness and hope for a cure. Ancient Israel acted as a kind of clinic for human nature. The laws given to them functioned as a treatment plan for the sin disease. And when they ultimately realized that they couldn't perfectly follow that plan themselves, God sent his Son to become a human and cure our human nature. Jesus joined in the human condition and pressed his love into every corner of human nature. He defeated the sin disease once and for all on the cross, and he rose with a healed, restored, God-soaked, love-soaked human nature. In other words, Jesus created the cure to the sin disease in himself, and he offers us the chance to be cured too, and to join in his new life, the life that God always intended us for, through relationship with him. This is the story that we at the Anástasis Center think the Bible is telling, and we call it healing atonement or medical substitution. If you're hearing it for the first time, you probably have a lot of questions. And whether you're hearing it for the first time or the 100th, you might be wondering how Paul is engaging with this story in Romans. We'll work through different parts of Romans to see that, but I chose to start with Romans 5:10 because I think it highlights that last piece of the story very well. See, one of the things that bothers me about Calvin and Piper's explanations is that in a verse that connects Jesus' death to his life, neither of them mention the resurrection. As I noted, in Calvin's commentary, the editor connects this verse to Romans 8:34, which definitely does draw attention to the resurrection. So I have to think that when Paul writes Christ's life in Romans 5:10, he has the resurrection in mind as part of that. But it makes sense why the resurrection is glossed over or put to the side in penal substitution. Because in that version of the gospel, what does Jesus' resurrection actually do to save us? Not much, really. Jesus' death dealt with God's punishment, and we already know from elsewhere in Scripture that God can raise us from the dead if he wants to. So what does Jesus' resurrection actually contribute to our salvation? The most common answer I hear is that it provided a sign that Jesus really was God and that his sacrifice was accepted. But Paul seems to have a lot more than that in mind. A lot of the discussion in the rest of chapter 5 and 6 is about the way that Christ's resurrection has changed something for us here and now, not just post-Judgment Day. I think that, in contrast to penal substitution, healing atonement helps us better understand what the resurrection does. Humans are made for God's vision of life and relationship, but the sin sickness gets in our way. Prior to Christ, things were stuck that way, but the resurrection changed something. Paul says in Romans 6:4 that just as Christ was raised from the dead through the glory of the Father, we too may live a new life. Jesus becomes the firstborn of a new humanity that we can enter into through relationship with him. And I want to highlight the word new, because English doesn't do justice to the Greek word that gets used there. See, in Greek, there are two words that we translate into English as new, neos and kainos. Neos means new in an old kind of way. It's the kind of new where if your shoes wear out, you might buy a new pair of the same shoes. But kainos means new in a new kind of way. It's like if your shoes wore out, you might forget shoes altogether and go buy a new jetpack to get around. Jesus is the firstborn of a kainos humanity, a humanity that is new in a new kind of way. And that kainos humanity is a result of his incarnation, life, death, and especially his resurrection. There's a transformation that has occurred, a transformation that we're invited to participate with God to work out in ourselves. It calls us to change the way we live, change the choices we make, change the way that we treat ourselves, other people, and the environment, change the way that we engage with God and with the systems that exist in society. And we're not changing these simply because we feel like we owe God for what he has done for us. We're doing it because doing good things is how we experience the fullness, goodness, love, joy, and life that God has wanted for us from the beginning. This is what is open to us through Jesus' saving life. To be fair, I think that for a lot of Christians who preach penal substitution, the stuff that I just mentioned is still important to them. And it should be, because those are the kinds of things that we see Jesus, Paul, and the other authors of the New Testament instruct Christians to do. So if you're taking the Bible seriously, you should care about them. But the question is, do you care about that stuff because of your theology or in spite of it? If your framework for the Bible is that we do bad stuff that deserves punishment, but Jesus took that punishment instead of us, why should we care about the poor or be kind to our neighbor? Is it just so that we can be seen as good people when we share the gospel with others? Or because we owe Jesus our obedience given what he's done? Is God just a finger-waving parent constantly guilting us with, "Don't you know what I sacrificed for you?" And what happens if we don't do that stuff? God can't punish us any further because he's already punished Jesus. Are we then just trying to avoid somehow making Jesus' punishment on the cross even worse? Or does God continue punishing us just a little, despite having already punished Jesus? I think that these are real questions that are worth struggling through, because they affect how we see God, how we see ourselves, and how we stay motivated to live out our faith when times are hard. There's a world of difference between a God who kind of wants to destroy you, but thankfully doesn't, who is equally satisfied with either your obedience or your punishment, and a God who fully cares for you, who has been working for thousands of years so that you could be made whole again. Between a Jesus who is primarily working to deflect God's anger from us, versus a Jesus who is working to restore all of creation and repair all of the harm that has been done in the world. When Paul says that we will be saved by Jesus' life in Romans 5:10, I think he has the latter in mind, that we will be saved not from God's punishment, but from the sin sickness, and will be saved for all the goodness that God the Father wants to pour out in us and on the world. These are the kinds of things that are at stake when we talk about the Bible story, So it really matters that we consider what the Bible and its authors are really trying to tell us. So stick with me, and we'll work our way through other parts of Romans to see how this story of healing atonement and restorative justice shows up. I realize that I didn't do a lot of exposition in this video, but hopefully you got a view of the big picture and some of what's at stake. We'll come back to Romans 5:10 in the future when we have some more context to work with, but hopefully this video got you thinking. If it did, make sure to give it a like before you leave and consider sharing it with others who might be interested. If you don't want to miss out on future videos, be sure to subscribe and enable notifications. And lastly, the Anástasis Center is funded entirely from donations. So if you found our work helpful and want to ensure that we can do more, please consider giving a one-time or monthly donation. You can find the link to donate and other links that explore the topics in this video in the description. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.